I live in East Oakland, which is where the Black Panthers used to patrol the streets with guns looking for police who were harassing black people, which was very common in Oakland in the 1960s. The Panthers did that until 1967 when Governor Ronald Reagan signed the Mulford Act, which was specifically directed at disarming the Black Panthers and anyone like them. And ever since then, it has been near impossible to own a gun in big cities where most African Americans live. That's all changing now. The genie is out of the bottle. Technology can't stop this anymore. Now we can print our own guns on printers that cost only $200. The people's time has come for providing for their own self-defense. We all know, don't we, that the police will not protect us. We have to provide for our own security. And you can do that by taking a groundbreaking, revolutionary, unprecedented course that no other university would dream of touching at Renegade University. It's called Make Your Own Guns, a guide to 3D printed firearms. It's a webinar that's being taught every Wednesday in March by Control Pew, one of the leading producers of instructional videos and blueprints for 3D printed guns. Go to renegadeuniversity.com, look for the course on the front page, check it out, and sign up, and I hope to see you there. I will be a student. Thanks. This is the Unregistered podcast, and I'm Thaddeus Russell. This is a show about ideas, people, and behaviors that are considered inappropriate, out of bounds, or beyond the pale. The things you're not supposed to talk about if you're a school teacher, a college professor, a businessman, a politician, a parent, a neighbor, or even a podcast host. These are the things you're not supposed to say or even think if you're a good liberal, a good conservative, or a good citizen. Each week, I'll interview a person who has something bad to say. They might be a journalist or a professor. They might be a porn star or a drug dealer. They might just be an ordinary person with an ordinary job who doesn't care about the rules of polite society. I'm not interested in breaking the rules just to be a troublemaker. I'm interested in people who break the rules of conventional thought and to expand the scope of what is possible to say in our society. I'm interested in people who make me think. The concept of race among human beings was invented by slave masters to justify slavery. Then it was used to justify segregation. So why on earth do so many Americans today insist that race, this fiction, this destructive fiction, is the most important thing about you, about me, about all of us? Thank God for this week's guest, a professor of political science who's been calling into question America's worst idea ever. This is my interview with Cedric Johnson. I am joined from Chicago, Illinois, by a guy I first heard on another podcast many years ago, Cedric Johnson, a professor at University of Chicago. University of Illinois at Chicago.
That's right.
Do you still call it Circle?
Nah, well, when I meet older people, they still do. So I'll oblige them. But yeah, UIC is what we usually say.
Yeah, I come from the generation. I think I'm a little older than you. We was always called Circle, even though I've barely been in Chicago. But
sure.
So Cedric is people who've listened to the Barbara Fields episode a few months ago will be a little bit familiar with some of your thinking here, but I want to actually ask you a question that I think will help illuminate a lot of your thinking, which is quite radical. And by the way, the thing I love about your work is that it challenges, from my point of view, every side in the debates around policing and race and class. You're grounded in Marxism in some way, which I want to talk about, right? Probably your own way, because you're challenging Marxists too, even when you're making these arguments.
Right.
But that's really, I just love that about you and your work, that you're hitting all sides. You're making everybody think. And that's what this show is devoted to, is making people think. So I want to ask you a question that's going to sound a little dumb to people, but I actually think it does illuminate a lot of the radicalness of your work and your thinking. What
Mm-hmm.
do you think, Cedric Johnson, when you are asked by anyone, but especially like on a form,
Mm-hmm.
what race you belong to? What do you think and what do you say?
Well, I mean, I check Black, African American, right, on these boxes, on these forms. But I always do, right, with the internal process that, that is a social designation. And in my experience of Blackness and being an African American is sort of mitigated by a lot of different things, right? Having grown up in a French speaking part of the country, among, hearing Black people speak Creole French as one of the earliest sounds.
Where'd you grow up?
I grew up in Opelousas, Louisiana, so right
Hmm.
in the heart of Acadiana,
Wow.
and
Huh.
in a place that's right at the very bottom of the Mississippi Delta. So, to the north there's cotton. If you drive just north of Opelousas, if you drive south, you're gonna hit nothing but sugar cane for like at least a 2-hour drive till you get to New Orleans. So
Right.
it was right in the middle of two pretty intensive agricultural regions, or two crop cultures. So all that stuff is with me when I think about marking that box. And I also know that on my birth certificate, the word Negro is there, right? So there's that historical
Really?
dimension as well. Yeah. So in Louisiana, 1971, Negro was still,
Oh,
I
wow.
guess, the official word they were using. They hadn't quite caught on to Black Power just yet, right? So
71, huh?
yeah, yeah.
My God.
So yeah,
I didn't know that.
yeah.
All right. So geography, and you mentioned two agricultural crops, near
Mhm.
you or around you. So right away you're kind of like letting it be known where you're coming from on this stuff. So that
Right,
economics, what some people might call the material conditions
right,
of your life that are apart from, and you called it a social project or social construct of race,
right,
right?
right.
Apart from that, are important. Maybe are they do you think, and you know what I'm saying, a lot of people won't know, but we'll get into this in a second. Do you think those are the base of who you are, right? Or what is the base of who you are? Or is that even is that a good question even?
Yeah, I mean, that's a part of it, right? So I had to ride the contradictions. That's what I always tell people as a kid, right? I
Nice.
was
Nice.
I was the child of school teachers,
Mm,
right?
mm,
My dad was a band director in the public schools
okay.
until the public schools cut the band programs to the point where I had to become a historian, history professor.
A demotion, big time.
Because at one point Louisiana used to provide free instruments to kids in a lot of districts. So
Right.
you didn't even have to have the money to be able to purchase an instrument. But by the time I graduated high school, that was no longer the case, right?
Hmm.
So he was a band director. My mom was an English teacher at one point, who later became trained as a special ed diagnostician. So she would go around and give battery of tests to different kids, and in some cases they'd end up being in gifted programs, and others they would need special services, so like IEPs
Hmm.
and what have you. So I grew up with that as my immediate household, but then it was intergenerational household. My grandmother was a cook.
Hmm.
My uncle was a brick mason. He lived with us at times. And then the broader family, like my big extended family in Louisiana, was mostly most of the men were offshore oil workers, right? Or
Hmm.
construction workers.
Hmm.
And most of the women did care work, either as domestics in households or, um, you know, uh, preschool education, nursery schools,
Hmm.
um, or some nursing. There were a few people who were like nurses' aides and what have you. But yeah, it was a big working class extended family.
Right.
My grandmother's brothers and sisters, my mom's brothers and sisters, all those people were in that context, right? So being a kid of parents who are slightly educated, you get a chance to bear witness to what's happening, but then also have some different advantages, right? Being a part of that class of Black professional
Yeah.
managerial folks who were in Louisiana in the 70s, right? This is huge. There's an expansion of the Black middle class. And,
All right.
I was a part of that. I saw it, and those were my friends, right? The kids who were the children of bureaucrats and coaches and all sorts of other stuff that was happening.
Yeah, I was going to say, so technically speaking, I mean, from anybody's perspective, really, your
Mm.
family, from what you say, is undoubtedly working class. Sounds like.
Right,
So that's different from upper class, wealthy capitalist,
right.
meaning they didn't own anything, right? Sounds like they all,
Nah,
but it's also not the poor because they all had jobs, they all had even
right,
careers, right? And
right.
then your parents though are, it sounds like you were saying this, are also middle class, not
Right.
because of, I don't even know what their salary was. It doesn't matter. What matters is it sounds like they had
Yeah.
some what we call middle class ideas, middle class attitudes. Is that right?
Yeah, I mean, as far as like education and the need to delay gratification and develop a work ethic, I mean, that was kind of broadly
Yeah.
pushed throughout, the different branches of my family. But even, they were to be a teacher in Louisiana, especially a black teacher in the 70s and 80s. I mean, it brought some status, right? Some power relative to other working class blacks. But as far as like incomes, I mean, when I left Louisiana in 1992, 93, the average starting salary for a school teacher was $18,000.
Wow.
So it's not like and they were
Right.
working school teachers in the 70s and 80s. So it's not like they were getting paid
Sure.
a shit ton of money to do the work they were doing, right? And then there was also waves of austerity that really sort of hurt teachers. And to be honest, they were really the only black unionists in that part of the state, right? Would be organized school teachers.
Yep.
So when I was a kid, my parents were part of the Louisiana Colored Teachers Association,
Oh wow.
right? That was still around, and then it folded into the Louisiana Educators Association, which was a branch of the NEA, and that didn't happen until I would say the late '70s, early '80s when we started getting those glossy magazines from the NEA in the mail. But
Yeah.
up until then, they were in a segregated, union. I think when they finished college and got their first job, so a lot was happening, but that kind of politics, right? A sort of union politics was available and was present within in the context of my household as it related to teachers. But in the rest of that part of the state, not so much. You had to get to New Orleans and other places to see like more in the way of organized labor, because the offshore oil workers are, legendarily anti-union anti-union across the Gulf Coast. So
Mm-hmm.
yeah.
Hmm. So then why do you check black or African American?
I mean, that's just, that was the world I was a part of, right? The few friends I would have in elementary, right? That was always conditioned. It was like white friends.
Hmm.
And most of the institutions I was in were black, right? So
Mm-hmm.
I went to Catholic school for a short period in elementary. That was an integrated setting, but as me and one of my friends who lives here in Evanston, we joke sometimes about what that was like when we played sports. It was always blacks against whites,
Oh,
right?
really?
Yeah, we were in a school that was beginning to integrate, right? My hometown had they had two separate Catholic schools, right? They had a black one and a white one, literally within eyesight of each other, right? You could stand in one and see the other one up the street. And in the 70s is when that was when the integration began, right? I mean, I think the federal desegregation order was 1969.
Hmm.
So when I was in elementary, a lot of those kids who were in middle school and high school had been part of the segregated system, right?
Mm-hmm.
So
Hmm.
so yeah, so that was the experience. I mean, we learned early on, right? That you're black, right? You can't
Mm-hmm.
participate in the same ways. You can't go to this kid's birthday party. You certainly can't date certain people, right? I mean, by the time you get to high school, that wasn't a part of the world that I grew up in. And the orientation was towards black institutions, um,
Hmm.
black communities. A few miles down the road would be places where you might connect with people, but the color line was still pretty strong at that point, 70s and 80s in Louisiana.
Right. So you had no choice but to be black.
Right.
Is that what you want to say?
Yeah, I mean, in a way, of course, right?
Yeah.
But I mean, but it was a rich, it was something I enjoyed. It was something I loved, right? As far as that social world, right? I still long for some of those things,
I bet you.
that
I,
we
I bet you do because you went to.
institutions, the people.
I was going to say I bet you do because you went to Southern University,
I did.
historically black university.
Yeah.
Again, so why did you choose Southern, and what did you like it? I mean, you must have. It sounds like you did.
So Southern was like the school where most people in my family went,
Okay.
right? In Louisiana, there's four black colleges. Southern's the only system, right? We've got the three campuses. Grambling is our rival as far as state schools.
Mm-hmm.
And then there's Dillard and Xavier, which are, the two private institutions. And um, I went to Southern to run track, right? My high school coach had been the coach of Southern's team at one point. He was a retired guy. And, my family went to Southern. It was close by, and my coach told me I should go there. And so I was going there, right? And I enjoyed it. I mean, socially, it was nothing better, right? It was great. You know, Academically, it didn't really prepare me for grad school. I should say that.
Right.
It was an open admissions school.
Mm-hmm.
And so, you could show up there with a GED, not having taken the ACT or SAT, take it on the spot, and they would just file it, right? It didn't matter what you got on it.
Mm-hmm.
And you would be admitted, right? As long as you could pay the tuition, which is great, right? That is true in my mind, equality of opportunity, right? Everybody gets a chance.
Sure.
And but then what that means in the classroom is that you got, some kids who turn down the chance to go to big state schools in other places or even Ivy Leagues in some cases. And you've got kids who just barely got out of high school or who may have gotten a GED while they were in prison or, some other kind of route, night school.
Right.
So there's that was rich in and of itself in terms of the kinds of conversations we would have. But if you were trying to really prepare for law school or grad school, you weren't going to get the kind of training that you needed to do that, right? So the moment I got to Ohio State and when I went to Maryland, it was always a mode of being in catch-up phase. In terms of content, reading, but not necessarily in terms of political understanding, right? Because when you sit across, the aisle or across from somebody who, was incarcerated and now they're trying to get education, that in and of itself is something that just changes your perspective, right? You develop a different sense of what public institutions should be doing, who they should serve, right? You develop a different sense of what mass incarceration was about, who was punished by it. So it's not, we didn't get it so much through the instruction, but it was the milieu of being at Southern University where you had a lot of faculty back then who were doing like zip code studies. Some of the biology professors going around and going door to door in Black neighborhoods that were adjacent to these massive like petrochemical refineries.
Okay.
And doing this basic work to try to identify if there were patterns of illness, and disease within these neighborhoods. They were doing that sort of work. There were people who were, who were engaged in anti-death penalty work. I got involved in some of that as a really young kid, like a freshman, in college. I think I met Sister Helen Prejean, of the Dead Man Walking. Yeah, and I didn't know who she was, right? This was like I was 18. My friends pulled me along to go with them to a meeting, and
oh, really? Wow.
Yeah, and it was like all nuns. It was like and around that time there was a guy named Dalton Prejean who was on death row, and he was executed. But we were trying to mobilize against that because he basically had such severe mental retardation that he should not have been tried, right, in a way or fit to stand trial. But yeah, so that sort of stuff was just part of the environment,
So it sounds like you were politicized early on then.
Yeah, I mean, even before that, right? I mean, at that point, by the time I got to Southern, I was pretty clear on some things. And Yeah, because I didn't mention this, but so in Opelousas, at one point we had the largest Black Catholic church
Hmm.
in the country. I think it's since been surpassed by a church in Galveston. But back then we had almost 10,000 parishioners,
Hmm.
and our pastor during the late 70s up through the 90s was Albert J. McKnight,
Hmm.
who born in Bed-Stuy. He claims his
Oh.
family was the first. They were the first Black family to move into Bed-Stuy, right? He said that when they moved in, it was mostly Jewish families.
Mhm.
And so he was ordained a Catholic minister and moved to Louisiana, was involved in desegregating Catholic church services, right? Where he and other, Black and white church members would sit together and violate the norms. And then he also was involved in establishing cooperatives among Black workers, farm workers, mainly around sweet potatoes, but some other crops.
Mhm.
So, like, by the time I met this guy, as a teenager, he was a force in our church, right? He was actually a person who was necessary for bringing almost like a Black power sensibility to my hometown, which was governed by whites,
Hmm.
up until the 80s, even though the majority of the population was Black. When McKnight came in, he kind of brings the ideology that helps people to kind of change, to sort of stand up, begin to run for public office. And in the middle 80s, we end up electing the first Black mayor, get a majority city council, Black chief of police.
Mhm.
So all this stuff is happening when I'm like, in high school,
Hmm.
and I'm involved in it, right? Like we had a school walkout in protest of a consolidation program. They were going to shut down a lot of small schools in mainly Black farming communities, that had been around. They were old Jim Crow schools, right?
Right.
They were going to shut those down, but they were going to build the new schools in these white neighborhoods. And so we protested, we marched on the Capitol. There were sit-ins, it made the national news. It was like on CBS News, which was a big deal back then, right?
Definitely.
In the 80s.
Huge deal. It was the only deal. It was the only way to
Yeah.
make the news in Washington, D.C.
Right. So like that was a part of the politicization. It wasn't just those big events, but it was like
Right.
the day-to-day things that happened at that church. We had a Black Youth Congress.
Yep.
We convene, and we had students, kids who would come from Texas and Mississippi to participate in this.
Mhm.
Um, Black Manhood Camp, right? Every summer. And
Mhm.
so I participated in that even when I was in college. 19 years old. I'm taking kids to go and visit one of the state prisons and
Hmm.
to meet with gang members and talk about why they should stay off, stay away from drugs and not get involved in crime. So all that stuff was happening, right? That was all, this was the real education. Like I said, in terms of the formal educational institutions, they weren't really preparing me for
Right.
grad school, but it was all this other stuff, the activism and the kinds of changes that I was witnessing up close, and McKnight, I mean, I actually drove out I went to California a while back. I went to LA and I drove out to Hemet
Mhm.
out in the Inland Empire to see him. He was retired. And me and a friend of mine who also grew up in the same church, we went out there and just hung out with him for a day. And I didn't know I pretty much figured that was the last time I was going to see him because he was up in age. He died the next year. But I just got a chance to thank him, right? Because the guy like took me as a shy, kid and rattled me. He was like he was kind of confrontational. He would tell you, you should be doing more things in the community and you should be paying attention and reading the news. And I didn't really have anybody like that who was confrontational. Like my parents weren't like that, right?
How many times have you been yelled at for not wearing a mask outside? I've been yelled at for not wearing a mask on hiking trails, on sidewalks, and at the beach. That's why today, when I was yelled at again, this is for the 10th time, I had to take some medicine. So I went straight home and got my Paloma Verde Essentials. They're soft gels which have 25 milligrams of CBD. their high potency tincture, which helps with things like stress derived from being yelled at. A few drops under my tongue, and I actually forget about the lady who snapped at me a few hours ago. Their gummies are just delicious, and thank God I have a new box. Well, I've eaten about half of them in a few days. These have 10 milligrams of CBD per gummy, so they will also help in these ridiculous times. Oh, this myth that you have to wash your hands all the time, even the Washington Post is reporting that that's bullshit. But nonetheless, it has taken its toll on my hands, which are now cracked and chapped and sometimes bleeding. I told you about the amazing THC-free hemp cream that Paloma Verde carries. I just found out about their salve, which is just as good. I am telling you, if you put this on some really dry, chapped skin, it'll heal it in less than a day. Guaranteed. Now, Paloma Verde CBD is the place to get your CBD products like this because they are a family-owned business. They're independent. They got no help. In fact, they got obstacles from banks who wouldn't get them accounts or even loans, who tried to open a brick-and-mortar store in San Antonio but were shut down by the stupid lockdown back in March. They give us 25% off in addition to being a business that we all want to support. 25% off every single product in their store. Also, they have put together 3 of the products I just showed you, my 3 favorite, the gummies, the tincture, and the soft gels into one pack called the Unregistered Combo Pack. It's just for us. Although it's sometimes called the Thad Pack. You can call it that. You get all 3 of those for 33% off. Just go to palomaverdestore.com, use the discount code RENEGADE, go wild, because it is wild outside. I am actually afraid to go outside now unless I'm willing to conform to idiotic, unscientific rules. If you're anything like me, you need some CBD in your life. Go to palomaverdestore.com, use the discount code RENEGADE, get that 25% discount. Oh, you get an additional 10% off if you just join their mailing list. So if it's your first time, you're going to get 35% off your first order. And the Unregistered Combo Pack, the Thad Pack, as I said, is 33% off. palomaverdestore.com. Let's all calm down, take some CBD, use the discount code RENEGADE, make your life, your body, your state of mind, but not the world, better. And I thank you.
They were more, about like encouraging education and, that sort of stuff. But like he was more of a, you have a right or a responsibility to be politically engaged. You know what I'm saying? Like you can't be.
It's funny. It sounds
slacking,
Yeah, it sounds right there. Like, well, maybe to some extent, it's a Du Bois Washington debate right there, playing out in your life. Is that right? Where you got your parents taking mostly the Bookerite position. It sounds like, right? Focus on yourself, self-improvement, through education, hard work. And I guess he's saying some of that, but he's also talking about political equality, right?
Well, not quite. I mean, my mom was politically active too. So was my dad. Like they had their own. They talk politics at home, but they wouldn't scold you about not being involved in politics, right? So my mom was actually the parish council president. So she was like the lay leader of the church. She had been elected twice, and she was involved in, a bunch of things locally. So yeah, they had their own political, focus, but they didn't have the same kind of confrontational thing, right? It was sort of like if you were going to be quiet and not be involved, then that's your choice. But yeah, he was the guy who would like call you out.
And his position, it sounds like, was, political action demanding equality now. Like it was the imperative, right?
Right.
Again, that's Du Bois basically, right? Whereas your mom sounds like a bit more Washington side, where it's like, it's not necessarily the thing to be doing is to be demanding political equality right now, and also not agitating. I guess it's really about the question of agitation. I mean, I would imagine they were both on the same side as to civil rights and legal equality and all that stuff, right?
Right.
But it's just how to go about it, right? Whether to agitate constantly, as Du Bois told people, or not, to focus more on yourself. But so you were, I mean, if people don't know this, they should, but you were born and raised in the mass incarceration capital of
Right.
the United States, and the United States is the mass incarceration capital of the world.
Right.
So they don't play around in Louisiana with locking people up, and they haven't for many, many decades. Was anyone close to you growing up? Must have been. You must have had people in your family incarcerated, certainly friends. But
Mm-hmm.
although it sounds like your family was mostly pretty solidly working class, so I'm not I wouldn't necessarily assume that you had people locked up in your family, but is that true?
There were some people who had definitely had brushes with the law.
Mm-hmm.
People who were arrested. As far as like long-term jail, though, right?
Right.
Like long-term sentences, those are more the people who my friends, people I was in school with, right? They were the ones who ended up going to jail.
Mm-hmm.
And that was actually, that was really later, right? That wasn't like when I was a kid. It was really in the moment when I was transitioning to go to college, right? That's really when it was a little bit of a lag, right? When you're in that kind of rural,
Mm-hmm.
smaller town thing, whereas I think crack cocaine hit a little bit sooner
Right.
in some of the bigger cities. The effects really were seen in like South Louisiana, probably like late 80s is when we really started to feel it. And that's when people who I had known in high school were like either, involved in shootings, or arrested. So for instance, when I took those kids to visit the one medium security prison in DeQuincy, Louisiana, when I was 19, when we were walking on the prison yard, I saw kids who I was in school with, right? They were there. So that was a reality, right? But as far as my immediate family, um, people who had been arrested, people who had problems with police and had problems with the law, but nobody who I can think of from like my mom's generation who aunts and uncles and stuff who ended up having like long prison time.
Yeah. It was all around you though. Had to be.
Yeah, no, absolutely.
Yeah. So I want to talk a little bit more about your background, then we'll get into your actual work as an academic, as a public intellectual. So most guests on this show, even though they are almost all intellectuals, would call themselves that. And me had terrible grade point averages in high school. We hated and mostly failed in school from K through 12. And as soon as we got to college, though, many of us like
got it together, right?
took off. I mean, I was a D and C student all the way from K through 12, basically. And then as soon as I hit college, I was like good to go. I was like flying. But I have a feeling that you were probably a better student than I was, based on who your parents were.
Well, not really. So I was good in elementary, right? I was great in elementary school. Middle school, I struggled.
Really?
Yeah, I was pretty bad. And then high school, I was bad as well until I just didn't give a shit, right? It was just it wasn't until like I think really my senior year that I started to get my act together.
Mm-hmm.
And then when I got to college, it was just easier, So
isn't that wild? It's
it's
not supposed to be that way.
Right? Yeah, so it was easier. And then of course grad school, you have to do, you had to step up a little. But yeah, there was definitely some years when I disappointed my parents for sure, because I was a kid who didn't care about this stuff. I wasn't interested in it. And yeah, so I'm part of the club, man. Don't.
I like you even more. I like you. Even more. I wear it as a badge of honor that my high school GPA was 2.4. So, which is actually not that terrible, but it's a C plus or whatever. But I just honestly, I find that most of the intellectuals I find interesting it's amazing, did poorly in school. There's lots of superstar academics who did do well all the way through, right? And went to boarding schools and or just public schools, but did really well. And they tend to be just less interesting. They're often more prestigious and more famous, but I guess it's just being the outsider, I suppose, and being like,
that's a form of rebellion, I think,
Yeah, and having I'm sure you had this too. Like I always had a critical perspective on what was going on in my schools, right? And I was always didn't have a lot of respect for my teachers.
Sure.
But I mean, did you feel that? It sounds like you did.
No, it was slightly different, man. I mean, the teachers I had, so I had throughout, I had a lot of black teachers, right? So it was
So did I.
These were teachers who had been, mostly black teachers. They had been part of that segregated system, right? So the way that they approached this was like, scolding and supportive in some ways, and encouraging, and then also just preparing you for the world, right? So that was different, right? Being in that space, it could be oppressive too, but
Mm-hmm.
it was definitely a different kind of moment, right? And I think that's where some of that, like you said, the socialization, the sort of bourgeois stuff was really working,
Yeah.
especially if you were a decent kid. If you were like a 2.4, GPA, they were gonna, this guy's great, because everybody else, the other kids who were like totally failing, right? And who
Uh,
want to fight every day, right? So
oh, okay.
they would,
Yeah.
they would treat you differently, even if you were that student, right? You showed up and you read and you tried. But um, yeah, I mean, I miss it. That whole generation of people um, who kind of had, what they brought to us again was like that historical understanding. They had been part of the earlier system. They sort of had some real strict ways about how they thought we
Mm-hmm.
should approach the world, and it was another layer of education that came from that Louisiana upbringing.
Right. I was raised in Berkeley and Oakland, radically different in a lot of ways, of course. But in the 70s, I was in elementary school beginning of
Uh-huh.
1970, kindergarten 1970. And Berkeley was the first city in the country to forcibly integrate through busing. So
Right.
I was in the very Kamala Harris was in the second, I think,
I was
generation.
gonna say you weren't on the same bus.
We might have been, because she lived in my neighborhood too
Okay.
when we were that age, and then she left
Right.
and pretended to be from the hood. But no,
Yeah, yeah.
I got a lot. I'm sure you and I have a lot to say about her. But
Right.
the so I had a lot of black teachers. So because
Mhm.
they were really, especially in Oakland, it was all black teachers. But even in Berkeley, they integrated a whole bunch of those positions: principals, vice principals, and teachers,
Right.
especially in middle school. And I gotta say, they were a bunch of authoritarian motherfuckers, and
Right.
I still hate them. When I see Kamala Harris, and a little bit Barack Obama, but really Kamala Harris, she looks and sounds and acts the authoritarianism in her.
Yeah,
I
yeah.
know that. I know that person. I know, because I've dealt with them, and they've
Yeah,
been a big problem for me as a child. I mean, not since I was an adult, but
yeah.
it was different. And also, this is something that never gets talked about, but white kids who were integrated in the 70s and maybe in the 80s, but definitely in the 70s, in other words, the first generation to be
Mhm.
forcibly integrated, which is what it was, we got our asses kicked
Right.
and terrorized. I mean, there was a whole lot of, I don't know the exact source, but I would imagine there was just a whole bunch of pent up rage and maybe envy about our class position and
Right.
our whiteness. I don't know, but we were inside the school, we were the lower class for
Yeah.
sure. Outside the lower school, different story. A lot of white kids would go
Right.
up into the hills to their fancy houses. I didn't, but like,
Yeah.
it's an untold story, and it needs to be told. The costs of integration,
Right.
and the way it was done so
That's
heavy-handedly,
interesting, man.
by putting children on buses. Why
Yeah.
why is that a left? That should not be a left-wing position. I think it's just a gross thing to do to children.
Yeah.
To
Yeah, it's
to
different. We had this thing where with integration, right? The whites in my hometown set up their own schools, right? So
Yeah.
they created these all white private schools. And in some cases, they didn't have a building for it. They were just like teaching outside, like
Yeah.
rather than let their kids. At least till they got a building, rather than let their kids attend these schools with blacks, right? So,
Wow.
yeah, we had those, and those were around until I graduated high school. They were still
Hmm.
there. Cherry Street Academy, Amy Bradford Ware, Belmont Academy. Those schools were still around, and they had been strictly for whites.
Hmm.
So
Pri-
the
Private
white
school.
kids who left at my schools were like hard ass. Like you weren't gonna beat some of them, right? They were, because they were the only ones, right? They were like used to being
Yeah.
around black kids at my middle school, which had housing projects all around it. Yeah, the few kids I can remember in middle school, yeah, you couldn't you got to really scrap if you were gonna deal with them,
Mhm.
like that.
Yeah. Last question, I think, although I love talking to you about this stuff. Your background is fascinating. I didn't know any of this. This is great. Because you don't really talk about it much in your work.
Nah, I don't.
Yeah, good. I'm glad to be breaking new ground here. But it's totally fascinating, and it illuminates so much of you. Now I see you in a really, not different way, but I see you in a much fuller way. Like I know your work, but it's very different than this. Or I can see it's all connected. The Cedric Johnson, I can see Cedric Johnson as an 18-year-old very much as the same guy now.
Right. Right.
Racism. Racism is sure real. Maybe race isn't, right? We know
Right.
it's a social construct. We both agree, right? There's no scientific basis to it.
Right.
No real material basis to it, right? It was invented in this country for the express purpose of justifying slavery, you know, first by Thomas Jefferson and then by a couple centuries of race scientists.
Right.
Racism is real. Race is real too, in that it certainly causes people to organize their lives around these concepts, even if they're social constructs, right? They're just ideas, but they are ideas that animate and really structure the way we think about this world, especially in this country.
Sure.
Almost everything, so many things are really seen through the lens of the black-white prism, which is so strange too, since this country is not just black-white. Hello. But you had the racism that you grew up with is really different than the racism I grew up with. And I'm not talking about getting beat down by black kids. I'm talking about racial. I'm talking about white people now. And this has been the subject of my criticism for decades. Racial liberalism is a very different animal, right? Which has dominated my world since I was born, which is much more about, for me, a patronizing attitude for black people. And I mean, that's really how affirmative action ended up playing out and all the quotas. I know you've said lots and lots about this, but that's been my world. And then I go to college and university in New York City. You know, I've only been among racial liberals, basically.
Right.
And I argue that it's a form of racism, but it's a very different form than what you grew up around, which is like the old school, hardcore, no question, unambiguous racism, right?
Right.
Right. First of all, did you see any, this is an interesting question, I've never even thought about this, as someone growing up in 1970s Louisiana, did you see any racial liberalism going on like that?
Yeah, not so much. I mean, I'm trying to think. I mean, there were people, right? Like, when I was in the Catholic school, there were the nuns who were kind of progressive minded. And with, I mean, the way I recall it now would be as those are the memories of when I was a kid. So some of that was kind of patronizing, right? There were moments when they would do things that were totally fucked up. I remember one time this nun found out that a friend of mine were like in the church choir. And she asked us to come up in front and sing, I think we sang like Go Tell It on the Mountain or something for the class, which is totally humiliating for a kid like in elementary, right? But she was so happy because she could get these, she may even said something about like how great it was, for us to sing the songs and so stuff like that, right? But there was also violence too, right? So there was moments where, I mean, there were a couple of kids I remember who were, really violent. One of them ended up dying in a car accident, but they were bullies, right? Essentially, but they would bully black kids, and one of my cousins, beat the shit out of these two kids, right? It was like the one was a teacher's son, and the other was the kid of, a guy who ran like the U.S. Department of Agriculture, like branch office. And she beat the hell out of them. And then, because she was like bigger than them, middle school when late elementary when girls are bigger, right? And she was suspended, and these guys weren't suspended, right? So that was like the early, you're like, what the hell, right? Like, what the hell? How does this happen? But I guess that's more the overt racism. But yeah, things like that would happen. But as far as like liberalism, I mean, there were people probably in my mother's orbit, like some of her coworkers who were, maybe more liberal minded, but it was in that context, it was a relief, right? To have people who were
wait, you're saying you'd rather sing Go Tell It on the Mountain and then get beat up by a white racist, huh? Right. You'd rather be like humiliated and treated like a child than get your ass
right.
Well, guess what, Cedric? Guess what? To me, that is exactly
what you're talking about, right?
That's the choice that was given to black people from about 1945 onward.
Right.
You can deal with those crackers who are going to fuck you up, or you can come under our care and protection And
Right.
all you got to do is sing a song every once in a
Sing a
while.
good spiritual.
Sing a good Negro spiritual to get everyone really sad and crying. Make it,
Right.
and you
Right.
you adopt the position of victim, and we are the saviors, and we're gonna get along great.
Yeah.
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 All right. Last thing, I swear to God, about your background, but yet again, another story of the centrality of the church, the Black church. Even though it's Catholic, it's still, I
Mhm.
think your church would be considered part of the Black church, right?
Right. Right.
In the lives of African Americans. I mean, my God, it's incredible how many African Americans, because this doesn't happen with most white people. I mean, some white people for sure, but
Right.
just again and again and again. And it doesn't even matter what the field is, whether you're Cornell West coming out of the church in Sacramento, or you're Cedric Johnson coming out of the church in Louisiana,
Right. Right.
or you're Aretha Franklin coming out of the church in Detroit. I mean,
Yeah.
it's ubiquitous, it seems,
Mhm.
especially of your generation. That's one just observation. And the second, and this maybe will segue into your work, and I'm not sure I've heard you talk about this, you might have, but the Black Lives Matter generation of
Mhm.
activists have displaced the old civil rights generation as the leaders, the self-appointed leaders of,
Mhm.
Black politics, right? They don't come out of the church.
Right.
They come out of colleges, right? That's who they are. I mean, they don't
Right.
talk the church. They're not influenced by the church. They're influenced by Angela Davis. They're influenced by Kimberly Crenshaw. They're influenced
Right.
by, I wish, Cedric Johnson.
Right.
And I wish they were influenced by you and Barbara Fields and Adolph Reed. But there, seems like a major, I don't even know what to do with this, but does that sound right to you, that the church, the Black church, has been displaced by this new generation of activists over the last 5 or 6
Right.
years? Does that make sense?
Yeah, I mean that's definitely the case with the most visible of the these Black Lives Matter activists. I mean, there's a couple people I can point to, in a few places who still have those church ties or who are like,
Mm-hmm.
but I mean, I don't blame them, right? Like I cut ties with the church when I left Louisiana, right? I mean, even when I left for college, right? That was no longer,
Mm.
um, that was no longer a part of what I was doing. And like everything else historically, right? That moment, that golden age of political activism in the church I grew up in
Mm-hmm.
disappeared, right? The pastor was reassigned. They
Mm.
brought in some people who didn't have the same political, imagination, and everything went downhill. I mean, these bastards even wanted to take down, we had black statues of, Jesus and other,
Oh,
important
yeah.
figures in Christianity, and they want to take those things down. so, so it was a complete reversal, right? And for
Wow.
me, like it was no longer the same place. And I had my own reasons for not being involved in church stuff because I was no longer, a kid and no longer forced to do it by my parents. But yeah, this later generation of folks, I mean, they're more secular. I think most Black people, are
Yeah.
not really church goers, even if they say they're Christians. So um yeah, they are influenced by a different set of institutions, but the main one being, like you said, the kind of liberal arts and humanities left.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that has some serious consequences, right? Because at least, the church, for all of its problems, these are
Mm-hmm.
important and well organized institutions, right? And they know how to like make things happen. They have some respect for accountability, representation, maybe some democracy in certain instances.
Mm-hmm.
Um, but the idea that you get from a lot of younger people, and I'm saying this because I've got students, my own kids, and other people who've been connected to different formations. There's a disposition about institutions as just simply being rejected out of hand, right? As not important or immediately oppressive,
Yeah.
that I think steals whatever real political impact some of these mobilizations could ultimately have, right? I mean, there's a fetish of mobilization,
Right.
but really a disdain for organizing um, and institutional politics, I should say,
Yeah.
right? I mean, beyond, oh, we have the first person who looks like me who's now in this position, right? There's the sense that somehow, if I really want something from local government. I have to organize people. I have to attend meetings. I have to sit across the table from people who I may not give a damn about on a regular basis. But because we can work together to achieve something immediate, we should do that, right? That sort of politics. I mean, I've had so many conversations with younger people where it seems like that is like speaking another language. They're like, what are you talking about? Like that sounds boring. It's not interesting.
Mm-hmm.
It's too much in the way of compromising. It's too old fashioned, you know.
Right.
And to be honest, I'm kind of burned out on it. I mean, if that's the world they want to have, where it's just all about performing your political convictions in public, let them have it, right? But for those of us who've been paying attention a little bit longer, in order to get the things we want, you got to be engaged with political life as it exists, institutions as they exist, and that's not fun. That's not something I'll be posting on Instagram about, right?
Mm.
You know,
We might
I'm sounding like an old man now.
uh, you're younger than I am, but you do. Yeah. No. It's just it's the politics that I grew up with. So I was born and raised a Marxist. I am still deeply influenced by Marx, by the way. A lot of my listeners are horrified by that, but I think he was right about a lot of stuff, actually.
Yeah, absolutely.
But so I hear what you're saying. I know your argument. I used to make that argument all the time when I was a socialist activist. But now that I'm not a socialist anymore, I'm also, much more importantly, I just have this. I'm for deinstitutionalization. Actually, I think everyone should deinstitutionalize. That doesn't mean like leaving your job at the state school you teach at. I'm talking about separating your identity, your psychology, your mind from. Stop identifying with the goddamn institution that employs you, right? And
Right.
professors, I know you see this, right? Professors, they identify with the fucking university that's their boss.
Right.
I'm like, you think these people have your interest in mind? You think that's your employer? And a lot of them are Marxists. I'm like, they talk about we, us, they care about the institution. They like want to make the institution. Oh man, hell, this is just the guys who give me paychecks. That's all.
Yeah.
But I also completely hear you about the performativity of BLM politics and just left wing, not BLM, left wing politics generally these days.
Right.
Outside of the Bernie Sanders wing, I'd say of the American left, and I have my problems with Bernie, but he's not doing a performance. He's not doing a song and dance. He's talking about real policies, right? Whether you agree with him or not on those policies, he's doing real political work, in my view.
Yeah.
Which is why he's the only politician I basically have any respect for, even though I have differences. But all right, so let's do this. So you wrote a very provocative article, I forget, a couple of years ago, I think it's 2018 maybe, and you've certainly said this many times in other forums. You call BLM, Black Lives Matter, part of neoliberalism. I want you to, that's a hell of a charge, man, because neoliberal is like the worst thing you can be on the left, right? That's that's like almost an epithet to call someone neoliberal, right, these days. So flesh that. You might be right though, but I want you to convince me. How is BLM part of the neoliberal movement? And I'm not here to carry water for anybody, especially BLM.
Right.
Don't worry about that.
Yeah, I'm trying to think of where exactly, what place you talking about.
Yeah, it's a tough one.
Huh?
It's a play. You're trying to figure out how to enter that, right?
Yeah. And trying to think of like when did I say, like, what did I say in that moment? I'm thinking this was the Panthers piece for Catalyst.
There was one that was titled.
Was this the thing that came out last year with the
title had Black Lives Matter and neoliberalism in it, so you can't escape.
Okay. Yeah. This was last year. So yeah. Yeah, I mean, so my concern last year, right? Witnessing everything that was happening after the murder of George Floyd. On the one hand, I was irked by how many people just because people out in the streets, they imagine that this was something significant, which always happens, right? There's a sort of
right.
There's a sense from many people on the left, a lot of my friends, they're waiting for the big event to happen and then everything will get better after that, right?
Right.
It's kind of like the Deus ex machina notion of
Mhm.
social change, right?
God will come in and change history for us. We don't have to do anything. Yeah.
Right. So I think many people thought this was that moment, right? That the finger of God was at work, and I didn't see it as in that sense. I saw, the liberal dimensions and liberal origins of Black Lives Matter really, showing, revealing exactly what it was, right? Because it was so easy for all these different corporations to embrace it, fully. I mean, it's not a
Right.
tough thing to embrace, right?
Right.
And if as Black Lives Matter as a slogan, as a hashtag has done, if the problem is fundamentally one of Black people not being able to walk the streets in peace,
Mhm.
Black people, not being safe in their own homes, or not being able to drive to the store, right? Like, which is the way it gets rehearsed rhetorically, right, with a lot of
Mhm.
different folks. If that is the fundamental problem, right, then the solution is an improved version of what we have, right? A liberal capitalist society where everyone can participate, everyone can do all the things without being discriminated against, without being mistreated. And from the very beginning, I mean, and David Harvey got into a lot of trouble by saying this, at least in the circles of people who were reading the work. He said that after Ferguson, or as he was watching the events of Ferguson, he didn't see much anti-capitalism, right? And he took a lot of shit for that, because people were like, well, no, of course, there's always this idea that if you criticize Black Lives Matter, then you really don't know it. That's the response you get. You don't really know the right people. If you were paying attention to this over here, it's like a shell game. If you were paying attention to this over here, you would actually see it.
Mhm.
And then if you look over there and you say, well, I see the same thing over here, then we have to talk to somebody in this other place. There's somebody else who's more authentic and more connected to left politics, and you just haven't had a chance to engage them yet.
Mhm.
So it's sort of impossible to criticize it in some of these contexts, at least with people who are devotees, right? Um, but for me, it's always been a liberal project, right? It's always been, I think, a misdiagnosis of the problem that we face. And if anything, the power of the mobilizations last year, and I said it, other people said it, provide the perfect moment for corporations to shift gears and shift direction away from the kinds of pressure they were feeling from all these essential workers and delivery workers and other people who are protesting for better conditions, better wages, more PPE, right? So they shift away from that towards an embrace of, various anti-racist initiatives. And I mean, it also provided the perfect valence for Biden, right? Biden is sort of reborn um, in this moment. I mean, he knew that script, right? He knew that he could get up and, he just dusted off the same script of the last few new Democratic presidents. And so for me, if it wasn't a matter of co-optation, I think that's the other problem I've heard on the left. They say, well, Cedric, don't get too carried away. Co-optation always happens. And I'm like, well, no, this is not co-optation, right?
No.
This is actual convergence between two very similar
Yep.
ideological positions, right? There's not a
Mhm.
rejection of capitalism among a lot of
Mhm.
of BLM, rhetoric and activism, and that as a result, it was easy, right, to sort of combine forces with Biden and Kamala and everyone else since, right, and that's where we are now, right, with the language of equity and systemic racism as part of the administration, right? It's part of the national regime at this point. So
Right.
I don't really see it. I mean, sure, there are people here in Chicago who are calling for have been for some time, demanding more in the way of redistribution, like downsizing, cutting police budgets, defunding police, and then funneling that into social programs. I think even that is limited, right? And
Hmm.
I mean, yeah, sure, we should do those things. But people were saying the same things. They were critical of that very move back in the 1960s. You know, there's a passage from Carmichael and Hamilton where they make the point that,
Stokely and Charles, just for people who don't know. Yeah,
right.
Stokely
So
Carmichael, Charles
Carmichael and
Hamilton.
Charles Hamilton, Black Power,
Right.
where they criticize, those local governing regimes that want to build a new playground, or they want to bring in the mobile swimming pool, right? To try to appease people.
Mm-hmm.
And that won't help, right? That's not gonna deal with, even in their analysis, it's not gonna deal with the real problems.
Right.
And so I think, you know, there's a lot of problems with defund. I mean, I don't know if you want to go into those things with that position, but I just think that, it's militant, right? It's a militant rhetoric because it calls out racism, and it looks even more militant in the wake of, or in the context of, a Trump regime, what it's all this denial and all of this sort of right wing and proto fascist bullshit, right? But I think for when we really hold it up, and look closely, I don't think Black Lives Matter is as radical as people imagine it to be, and ultimately it's a misdiagnosis of the problem of policing and what we need to do in order to resolve it.
Oh, amen to that. I'm going to push back a little bit, or just ask a question actually about your use of the word capitalism. So sounds like you're saying the fundamental problem of BLM is it didn't raise larger structural questions, or questions about the structure of our political economy. And you said your shorthand was capitalism.
Mhm.
If you mean the American version of capitalism as it
Mhm.
exists today and has for many, many decades,
Mhm.
you mean a system in which the government, the state, is enmeshed in capitalist modes of production from the top to the bottom and across the board, right?
Mhm.
Then I'm with you 100%. I mean, that is to me the source of most of the problems people have of all colors in this country, is that particular entity, which is really it's corporatism, right? Which was the basis of fascism, by the way. That's the economic basis of fascism, and no one will disagree with you on that.
Right.
Yeah, the government does all kinds of stuff intervening in the economy, and a lot of those things they've done have
They don't
direct
help us.
that
They don't help us, right?
well, I mean, not only that, they've laid interstate freeways. I was in New Orleans, I think 2 years ago, and how
Mhm.
they just cut that city in half with the 10
Right.
interstate,
Yeah.
the 10 freeway, and cut off the black neighborhood like
Right.
Treme and other
Which,
places,
yeah.
from the rest of and this happened in Baltimore. Baltimore's got one of the worst examples of that, I think. I've never
Yeah,
been to
all
Baltimore.
over, man. It's,
All over
it's
the place. Where I live in East Oakland now, and it's the 580 freeway. Just
mm,
completely, it's like on the one side, it's white people, rich people in the hills, and the other side, it's like everybody who's not. And it's, by the way, it's mixed in terms of color, but like it's working class and poor, and that's that. But the freeway just cut that city in half so that the good stuff is on one side and all the
right.
shitty stuff is on our side.
Yeah.
But so I mean, if you agree with that, I mean, you're not saying that just a free market alone, the free
Is the
market alone
problem.
is the problem? Or
Nah, not at all.
okay.
Mm-mm.
Yeah, then we're down. Then I'm good.
Yeah, I was gonna say, man, I've lived in a couple of places where people they have like a celebration or a commemoration of the community that was killed by the highway, right? So when I
Oh,
lived in
really?
Columbus, yeah,
Oh, that's great.
Columbus had a thing called
That's great.
the homecoming that was for the east side of Columbus, which was cut off by, I think it's the 71 that cuts through the middle of that city. And
Uh-huh.
then in Rochester, New York, they had Clarissa Street reunion,
Oh, that's
which
fantastic.
Clarissa Street was like one of the black commercial thoroughfares that had like jazz clubs and other things at
Oh,
one point.
yeah.
And they built like a inner loop highway wrapping around downtown that cut off Clarissa Street from the rest of the black neighborhood and pretty
Uh-huh.
much killed it. But yeah, it's really wild, but that's everywhere, right? That you see
Mm-hmm.
that sort of,
Mm-hmm.
but that's really where the work that I'm writing, finishing up now, the book I'm doing now, um, really makes the argument that we have to go back to that post-war period to understand how we end up with the policing regime that we have, right? The kind of policing that we have. So I don't think we got to go back to patty rollers or even to, urban police in New York City in the, late 19th century, even though that's important for understanding the more fundamental role of police, right? Which is to secure the conditions for capital accumulation, right? But the peculiar kind of policing we have now, right, to me, really takes shape in that post-war context where all those things you're talking about are being launched, right? This sort of massive investment in highway construction,
Mm-hmm.
the radial expansion of cities and the birth of suburbia, the new urban landscapes that really resegregate the population in racial lines in a way that was not there before, right? There was certainly segregation, but it was block by block, neighborhood by neighborhood. Now you have this kind of spatial dispersion of more upwardly mobile whites, I'm overgeneralizing, but to
Yeah.
the periphery, and then working class and poor people, mostly black and brown, confined to the inner cities, even though that's reversed, in recent years, recent decades. But I think that's where so much of the understanding of cities, the fear of urban spaces,
Mm-hmm.
as well as the worsening, conditions for that black and brown poor,
Right.
really begins. And police kind of steps into that breach, right? Especially in places like California, in the 50s and 60s, people like William H. Parker, who coins the term the thin blue line, really steps in, and his ideology is clear, right? The police are there to protect white middle class, virtuous Americans from
Mm-hmm.
organized crime,
Mm-hmm.
corruption, godless communism, and black and brown people who might threaten and take the things that they have, right? So it's really clear, like during the 1960s, 50s and 60s, with people like Parker, but also, national politicians. Reagan is one of the first people to talk about law and order and use that phrase, but quickly followed by Wallace, George Wallace and Nixon, and Daley here in Chicago.
Mm-hmm.
So there's a broad sense of a defense of police, right, and the role of policing in maintaining a certain kind of order, which, as you point out, is an unjust order that is deeply supported and subsidized by the federal government, as well as state and local governments. And so we gotta, I think, this is a tall order, but that should be our focus, right? I mean, I don't think police are obsolete. I'm not really one of these people who was completely on board with full scale abolition. I mean, socialist countries needed police, right? If they didn't have them, if they didn't have a military, they didn't really last very long, right? Some of them that did, ended up still ending quickly. But I think you have to defend just forms of societal order, right? You have to have some legitimate use of violence to defend those. The problem for us is that we have police who are defending an unjust order,
Mm.
and they do so with violence and impunity, right? And so how do we address the conditions, right, that police are there to defend and to manage? I mean, I think that should be the focus. And for me, Black Lives Matter misses the mark, right? And the problem is you can't really get at the argument I just made in like a quick, Twitter post, right? I mean, I guess you could, but um, it takes a lot more work to kind of get at the heart of what's going on here, and who
Mm-hmm.
who the real victims are, and how we're all implicated in it, right? Because I don't think it's just a problem with the police. I mean, if I buy a house in a in a gentrifying part of Oakland, I mean, I'm part of the problem in a way, right? I'm not an evil person, but my lifestyle and the things I'm enjoying, I think you say Chicago anyway, it doesn't matter. Um, that's made possible by the very fucked up regime of policing and all of the bad, subsidization from the federal government and local governments of like real estate development and corporate headquarters relocating, all of that stuff, right? Um, I'm a part of that, right? So I think we have to sort of stretch a bit more and think about the broader context. It's not just the police. There's sort of the ugly edge of everything, or the ugly
Yeah.
spirit tip, but there's a
Yeah.
whole lot else going on.
Yeah.
This is the right way to begin it. I don't know. Maybe this is the start of a deeper, for a lot of activists and people who are engaged in Black Lives Matter. I hope.
I completely agree with you that the focus on police and especially their inner thoughts, right?
Right.
Their alleged racism. It's all about chasing down the racism inside the cops' minds, right?
Right.
That's the mission. And then what? Then what? Once we find it, and can we ever find it?
Right.
That's going to get us what exactly? As opposed to whether you think capitalism is the problem, or you think government intervention is the problem, or you think the conservative position, you think black culture is the problem, right? Or maybe it's all three, you know,
Yeah.
and sometimes I'm there, actually. I'm on all three, although we can talk about black culture, but those are at least structural attempts, systemic attempts to deal with the reason police kill 1,000 people per year in this country. Right now, I think more than 90% of those people were armed with guns. And, you know, and that's another, I don't know what to do with those people, the 900 people who were killed, but who had guns, who were doing stuff that if I were a cop, I'm sure I would have killed them. Even a lot of the unarmed people, if you read the cases, this is white and black, by the way.
Right.
And I definitely want to talk about all the victims of white victims of police brutality and brutalization who get ignored. This is one of my major campaigns, is just to talk about white victims so that we can have a not cross, non-racial coalition, right, to address the structural issues, which I agree are about things bigger than what's in some cop's head, what was in Derek Chauvin's head allegedly. Like, what is that going to get us if we find like a trove of like Nazi, you know, memoranda coming from his computer, right? Okay, then what? So then we're going to hire a bunch of non-racist cops. Okay, how are you going to do that? Like, how do you prove that someone is racist or non-racist? But so I definitely agree with you. I mean, to me, let's talk about the war on drugs. I mean, goddamn, like, talk about a government intervention that fucked black people. It fucked everybody. But my God, if Biden just legalized, which I think he can do by executive order, if he just put all the drugs that are on Schedule 1 on lower schedule, right, basically decriminalizing, that alone, that would be, I think, a sea change in neighborhoods that are predominantly black and brown.
Yeah, no doubt. I mean, and my thing with legalization, even of marijuana, I mean, if you're not going to exonerate people, man, I mean, that is just,
I know.
That's the most fucked up policy, to legalize but not exonerate and expunge the records of all the people who went to jail.
I got friends. I got friends, and I hate to say their race, but yeah, they are Caucasian who they were in jail on a weed charge 10 years ago, and they can't get a job now because it's still on their record.
Yeah, it's absurd, right? And yet, you know, you walk into some of these stores, it looks like a fucking you know, Apple store. You know, these cannabis stores, they're making huge money, you know, so like, what the hell? And then the guy who was selling, you know, a few fucking dime bags is in jail for 10 years and can't get a job when he comes out. I mean, it's ridiculous.
Because the fucking gotta stop cursing here. We're undercutting our credibility here, Cedric. Because these state governments, when they legalized, put in as a provision that you cannot get a job in a dispensary or in the marijuana business in that state if you have any record, any drug record, including marijuana. So it's like, as you were saying, so the guy who sold a couple dime bags on the corner back in 19 whatever, he can't get a job in his own fucking industry.
I mean, skills to use, you know?
Yeah, like, and it's an industry he was doing well in, that we all now, as is pretty much all agree now, is a perfectly legitimate industry.
Right.
But the poor black or brown or white kid who actually was an entrepreneur and made some good money selling a plant that makes people silly, I mean, he can't get a job in that industry anymore, and so you continue the poverty there.
It's insane.
It's insane. Yeah. Okay, so neoliberalism, BLM is neoliberal. Let me see if I get this right. Because it's an easy thing for the ruling elite, and I would count the heads of corporations for sure in that, and the political class overall, like, you know, people who are politicians. It's easy for them, and because it doesn't require any of the stuff that you're talking about or that I'm talking about, it doesn't require them to like decriminalize drugs. Joe Biden, why don't you do that? If you really favor helping out, you know, the black and brown people who got your ass elected, you know, why don't you like make those drugs legal so that the cops no longer are an invading army in every poor neighborhood in this country? It's
Right.
almost all drug stuff. I mean, all the gangs, I believe every single gang in this country was founded as what? A drug gang. Then they built up their arsenal literally from the money they got from selling drugs, and then they branched out into things like prostitution and getting immigrants over the border and all this other stuff, right? Gambling. But every one of those gangs, like if you go like the Latin Kings back to the 1950s in Chicago, I believe they all started out pretty much as drug gangs. That's where they got their money from, and that's where they got their power from, most importantly, because drugs are artificially high in price, so there's a lot of profit to be made, right?
Mm-hmm.
If you legalize drugs, you deprive them of that. Those drug prices drop, and they have to compete with legitimate businesses, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So I mean, you would eliminate the damn gangs who have terrorized primarily not me,
Right.
not me. I've never been scared of a drug gang in my life, but have
Right.
terrorized people in places like Harlem and Compton and the South Side of Chicago and everywhere. Right?
Right.
They will cease to exist. They will cease to exist, and what a glorious day that would be.
Yeah. I mean, I think we got to get to the underlying the underlying problem. Why would people have to rely on, you know, illicit drug trade to survive? Like, so I think there's that part as well, right? And
Sure. Yeah.
and we're at a point as a society, right? I mean, we're not, you just as old as I am, that there are all sorts of occupations that have disappeared, various forms of work that have disappeared,
Mhm.
over the decades. And that work is not coming back, right? So even though we typically think about globalization or globalized production as the boogeyman, capital intensive production and the increased use of technology has wiped out a lot of jobs, even jobs that were like lower level, entry level jobs, things like even fast food, right? They're moving more and more, inching more towards automation.
Right.
Um, whether it's the use of touch screens or even, I watched a video at one point. There's all sorts, you can go down all sorts of rabbit holes, right? But there was a video with a automated or robotic hamburger flipper, right? So, you can imagine walking into a place, in the not so distant future where none of the people who were there before working those little minimum wage jobs will even be necessary anymore.
Right.
So then we plunge a little bit deeper into a problem that's been here for a while, and it's been um, more felt by working class black and brown people, but also, whites in small towns. I mean, I drive around the Midwest. I had a son, my oldest kid was running track and cross country at his college, in central Illinois. And I would drive all over this region to go to his meets out in Iowa, out to Peoria, Indiana. These are some fucked up places, man. And I don't mean that in the sense, I know we're destroying our credibility. I don't mean that in the sense that there are great people there, right? These people
Right.
love this place, they call it home, but there are not a whole lot of prospects, right? And the
Mm.
story's the same. You go to Peoria, you go to Cedar Rapids, it's all the same sort of story. Cedar Falls, there was one great employer, John Deere or Caterpillar or some other,
Right.
manufacturer. And once that changed towards either, globalized production, or they just
Mhm.
simply, found the spot welders and everything else they could use to replace living labor, the prospects for those towns plummeted.
Mhm.
And you go there now and they've got the service economy that we see everywhere, right? The
Right.
Walmarts, the Targets, and whatever else. But there's not a whole lot else, in the bottom to hold everything else up. So it's a problem of cities, in terms of black neighborhoods and Latino neighborhoods. But when you get outside of cities, I mean, there are other people who are struggling and who don't have any help coming, right? There's not a whole lot coming to restore what was lost. And I think again, that is one of the bigger issues that we can't get to if we're trying
Mhm.
to get inside the heads of, Derek Chauvin or whoever it is, right?
Mhm. Mhm.
Um, or just simply engaging in the same sort of downward class blame, and demonization. So on the one hand, the right blames the black, poor for all sorts of things that are wrong with the society. And a lot of people on the left have turned to blaming, you know, rural and working class white poor, somehow as the base for Trumpism.
Yeah.
Um, so there's like it mirrors, right? It mirrors one another, and I think both of them are need to be rejected. Both of those that both veins of class politics.
What you did, I think, is just explain the rise of Trump, though. I mean,
Mhm.
I think that's a great explanation for the rise of Trump, right? I've heard you talk about Trump.
Mhm.
Yeah, it's these people in places like Peoria, right, who are
Right,
getting they're not only fucked.
right,
You got to stop
right.
using this word. I mean, no matter what your politics are, you can't deny that living in a place like Peoria is not great for your economic well-being, right? And they're isolated. I love the way you put that. They're cut off. There's no one coming to help them,
Right.
and simultaneously they're getting blamed by like media elites in New York City and Los Angeles as being the problem. By rich people who went to Yale. They're being blamed as the people who hold the power are
Right.
blaming the most powerless people in this country. What do you think's going to happen? They're just going to accept that lying down. They're going to be happy to hear this about themselves, that they're racist pieces of shit who are responsible for all that's bad, and that Trump's the worst president ever, which by the way is a ridiculous assertion, but that's what people say. I mean, come on now. We don't even have to look into too far back in history to find someone worse than that. I mean, on immigration, Obama quadrupled the number of people that Trump
Right.
deported. I mean, what? And he let out the significant number of black people from prison, and Obama did not. I mean,
Yeah.
I'm not even talking about Bush yet. I mean, come on.
Right. Right.
But yeah. So did I do a decent job of describing your analysis of the origins of Trumpism?
I think that's part of it. I mean, the alienation that people feel in those places, right? And I mean, having grown up in South Louisiana, I mean, it's palpable, right?
Bet.
When you're there, there are people who really feel like what happens in LA and what happens in New York has nothing to do with them, and or DC for that matter,
That's right.
And so a figure like Trump comes around, it's intoxicating to when he
Right.
speaks to them, he criticizes the coastal elites.
Mm-hmm.
He presents as though he's somehow a man of the people. And then I think also when he talks about his own success as a businessman, even though we know that that's smoke and mirrors. Many people want that, right? They think that they want to be a boss. They want to be able to tell people what to do and hire and fire the way that Trump does. And so I think that even in the left, too many people on the left miss that is still appealing to somebody. If you're like working a dead end job, that's a dream thing to be able to tell somebody, to go to hell and, you're fired, right? I mean, that really it appeals to some people. I think also, as far as South Louisiana goes, the other things that are more tangible, right? Like so many people, as I mentioned before, are connected to the petrochemical companies, whether that's with family who work at the refineries or people who work offshore or who do desk jobs at some of the different satellite offices. Um, what they hear in Trump is somebody who's going to be on their side. He's for fossil fuels, right? He's for pipelines. He's
Mm-hmm.
for coal mining.
Mm-hmm.
Even if none of those are sustainable, in the short run, which is the only run that they're caring about, he's their guy, right? They don't want to hear, and I've had arguments with family members about this. They're like, we don't want to hear about renewable energy, none of that stuff, because they know that their livelihoods will be crushed
Right.
if we make some radical break. I'm not saying, I mean, I think they're wrong, right? I think that there's ways we could do better, but I think we miss a lot of that on the left with the hillbilly elegy, white trash backlash
Mm.
understanding of what's going on. So there's people who are like those folks in Peoria who don't really have a lot of prospects. There's also those proto entrepreneurs, right? The people like the ones who were arrested at the Capitol,
Mm-hmm.
um, who also want to be like Trump, who
Mm-hmm.
they may be little Trumps in whatever areas of the country they're from because they own a car dealership or whatever else.
Right.
The woman who was killed from San Diego, was the owner of like a pool cleaning company,
All
right?
right.
She was
Yeah. Right.
also a veteran, right? So
Mm-hmm.
you've got those people who are not, they're not working class people. They're not the, the kind of stereotypical, person that we lampoon on the left and criticize, at cocktail parties. They're people who probably have some decent influence where they're from, and they have really clear class, interests in supporting somebody like Trump, right? They don't want to pay more taxes. They don't want to give somebody health insurance.
Yep.
So yeah, so there's that dimension too, just to add
For yeah,
another layer.
in left wing and Marxist parlance, they are the petty bourgeoisie,
Right.
right?
Or the lumpen bourgeoisie.
Now the thing no, no, oh, the lumpen bourgeoisie, yeah. That's funny. I never thought about that. That's right. They're lumpen culturally, but their
Right.
economic position is petty bourgeois. Yeah.
Yeah, absolutely.
Well,
Even Trump supposedly, did you see the thing he said that he was happy those people were supporting him? Supposedly this is what one of his aides said, but he didn't like that they were so low class.
did he?
As he was watching the videos of them storming the Capitol, right?
Don't you
Wish they were a little bit, more respectable, I guess.
don't you love his honesty? Come on, like we're gonna miss that. I mean, that's the thing that's the one thing I really appreciated about Trump. He kind of like lifted the veil on
Yeah,
what goes on in politics, in American
right,
politics, and he was very open and frank in ways he shouldn't have been
right,
to save his own career. Right, the FBI wouldn't have been, and the CIA wouldn't have been trying to take him down since day one if he weren't,
right.
talking shit about NATO.
Yeah,
You're not allowed to do that. You're not allowed to question the American empire, which he did. I mean, that's really why they went after him.
yeah. A lot of people like him for that, man. Unvarnished, really direct.
Yeah.
There's none of that kayfabe that goes on with all the rest of Washington politics, where everybody's friendly even though they're not, and
Right.
all the
Yes.
fakery.
So, all right. So here's where we're going to disagree, probably. Well, definitely. I've heard you say that, and you're not alone on this at all, but I would say the smart leftists have a structural solution to the structural problems you and I have been talking about. And for you, it is a bigger welfare state, in particular, you want a very large public works program, right? Where the government is directly employing people in job. Is that right? In projects that are created by the government, like the New Deal. The New Deal is the classic example. Like the Hoover Dam was the government paid for the building of the dam, hired a bunch of people, paid them wages, and then the idea was, the Keynesian idea was that they would then use those wages to go spend in stores to prop up the economy, or to boost the economy. But
Right.
I mean, you're not making the Keynesian argument. You're making the more Marxist socialist argument, which is the state needs to employ people to correct the poverty that causes the crime that creates this whole circle of insanity and violence and et cetera, and police brutality, right? So the answer to police brutality for you and a lot of people on the left, who I consider to be the smart ones on the left, even though I disagree with them, is greater government intervention in the economy, but in those particular ways, right? Like by not by giving subsidies to petrochemical corporations in Louisiana,
Right.
which, by the way, that's another thing to remember. I'm about to curse again. Those corporations were granted monopolies or close to monopolies in those places by government, by subsidies, by giving them the land, by building roads right up to their front doors, by putting the railroad right next to their factory, their warehouses. So am I right? I mean, I did hear you say this not long ago, just like 6 months ago, that you want to see a large public works project by the government.
Yeah. So the way I've talked about it, I mean, I think the way to approach this is more like at a municipal scale, right? Like I could see a place like Chicago or Cook County,
okay,
initiating a public works project. I mean, I don't think we don't have the power, right, or the numbers to really achieve much at the national level. But I think in some locales, right,
okay,
or the organization to do something nationally, right, we don't really have that. But in some locales, right, where you do have a strong support for defunding, a strong support for rerouting funds that were previously allocated for police budgets towards other kinds of things, I would prefer public works over the kind of after school programming or summer programs and summer jobs and those sorts of things that you hear in some of these discussions. I mean, I just think that it could be unwieldy, right? But if you use the state in the way that we did during the New Deal, right, where for the Works Progress Administration or even the Civilian Conservation Corps, I mean, there's something to be said for reorienting work towards producing value that isn't about the production of surplus value, right? So more like use values, right? I think that for me that seems enticing, right? So if I read, and maybe I'm just being overly nostalgic about the New Deal at times, but the idea that you would have out of work writers who are going around and producing a travel guide for people in the
Right.
1930s, right?
That was the WPA project did that.
Right, right.
Right.
The Federal Writers Project. I think that like that seems interesting to me, right? I mean, I'm
Okay.
not saying that's the only thing that needs to happen,
Mm-mm.
or um, the things that the CCs did with going around and rebuilding or creating this infrastructure of like public parks, national parks, and I actually spent some time in one in Tennessee
Mhm.
um, last October, and it was a treat to see the placard still there that this was a Civilian Conservation Corps project. That's interesting. I mean, I think our own times, our own moment calls for something different, right? I mean, so on the one hand, there are people who are not going to be absorbed into the economy, certainly not in a way that's going to provide them with jobs to sustain themselves. So there's that problem.
Mhm.
Then on the other side, there's a lot of value that's needed in cities, places like Chicago, that could make it a better place. It could make it a better place to live, and just simple things, right? So one thing that irks me about Chicago as a city, one, we have these open air train stops, and I don't know what the hell that's all about, right? That a city that has a winner, that just didn't decide to have indoor train stops, and
Uh,
sometimes it gets pretty treacherous, right? So like you get
right.
on the L, sometimes they're like it's so covered with snow. I mean, I'm afraid looking at some of these older people trying to navigate it. I'm sure people slip, whatever else. And the solution, they just toss sand on it, right? Which, I was talking to some students about this, and they didn't even notice it as a problem. They just accepted it as part of the
Mhm.
the uh, the way things were. But I'm like, there's better ways to do that. There's also security issues on the Chicago CTA system. A lot of robberies, a lot of muggings, and
Mhm.
absolutely no police presence on these
Mm.
trains, right? So you could be waiting for a train at like midnight. You're the only one on the platform on certain lines. And the
God.
way they try to address it is through surveillance cameras, right? Which will allow them to see how you got beat up, you were robbed, or murdered, but it
Right.
won't necessarily prevent it from happening. And so I think there are all sorts of things we could do in terms of care work, in terms of improving public transportation, in terms of beautifying public spaces in a
Mm.
place like Chicago, that could be coordinated in the form of a public works project, right? So I see it in that regards, not at the national level. I think the laboratory should be within local context, but that's an immediate way to end need and give people some independence, give them an option from not joining the gang and selling drugs, as you mentioned before. Um, I just think that's one way to do it, and it's been done before, right? So it's not like it's a
Yeah.
totally new
Yeah.
thing. But it would, from in my mind, it has to be something that happens alongside other kinds of progressive solutions. But it's all abstract at this point, right? We don't really have
Yeah.
the coalitions in place. Some
That's
people are literally against the idea of building those kinds of coalitions. So
yeah.
you
Yeah.
know,
Your public works project idea is pretty much exists only in your head.
a couple other people.
There's a handful, but doesn't mean
John
it's wrong.
Arena, a couple other people have the same thing. But yeah,
Yeah, for sure, for sure. No, I know,
I
but
think Frederick
but
Jameson
and
is
that
one.
doesn't mean that it's wrong. But
Right,
here, let me give you my take. All right, first of all, to say something in your favor. Oh, well, I didn't know this, that you said you wanted it to be local. I didn't hear before. That's awesome. That makes me hate it much less.
right.
And I'll tell you why. So, but one thing in your favor. So, like, I live in East Oakland, and anybody who's been in East Oakland will know what I'm talking about. The streets in East Oakland are a lot like the streets in New Orleans. I was in New Orleans a couple of years ago. I said earlier. You can barely drive on the streets. It's
A lot of
like
potholes.
not even, I mean, I'm talking about craters that will break
Yeah,
your axle if you drive on them, right? And
right.
they're on almost every street. I mean, I have to like do this. I have to swerve constantly. It's like driving through Beirut back
Really?
in the 1980s. Yeah, it's that bad. Well, New
Yeah.
Orleans. When I was in New Orleans, I mean, the streets were buckled. I mean, you literally couldn't drive a car on a lot of streets.
Right.
Bywater, which is where I was staying. Um, so uh, yeah, I mean, and then I'm paying like exorbitant taxes being in California and in
Mhm.
Oakland. We have super high local and state taxes for everything, and yet the streets are like this. What's
Right.
this about? So something's got to be fixed there. There's work to be done. We need to fix those streets. It's urgent.
Right.
It's a third world country in that way. I mean,
Right.
it
Right.
really is. Trump wasn't wrong about the infrastructure falling apart in this
Oh
country.
yeah.
And the goddamn BQE where I used to live in New York City, my holy
Mhm.
shit. Like I was terrified to get on that road anytime. So now to employ the people to get that done. So option one for the left has always been public works at the national level, like the New Deal. Okay.
Mhm.
Option two, which is being now presented, I love this, at the local level or the state maybe level. Much, much better. I might not even oppose it,
Mhm.
depending on who's in power. See, that's the thing I'm getting at here. So a national public works project. And Glenn Lowry, by the way, this is what he wants. The sort of right
Yeah. Yeah.
conservative. That's he's with you on this. He wants a national public works project to hire.
Mhm.
He says he wants the government to be employing millions of young black men building bridges and fixing roads.
Mm.
So for me, and I don't even care about the color. It's just, although the fact that they're young black men like makes it sting a little more. Even it's like,
Mhm.
so you're calling for Joe Biden to be their boss. And when Joe Biden gets replaced by someone who's going to be Trump, but better, more effective than Trump or worse
Right.
than Trump,
Right.
he's going to be their boss. Like, and we know, like, which president and which Congress do we think is worthy of employing, being the boss, being the daddy of
Right.
millions of not people like me, but poor and working class, mostly brown and black, but also a lot of white people. I am not into that because I hate those people. I mean, they are. Do we need to go over Joe Biden and his career? No, we don't. Not on this show, and I know
Right.
not with you. I mean, this dude is just about the worst thing that American politics has produced in my lifetime.
Yeah.
I don't want anybody to have him as the daddy figure who they're dependent on, right? And
Mhm.
who can put who will put a uniform on them while they're working with an American flag on one shoulder. And who
Mhm.
knows, it might even be a picture of Joe Biden. There'll be pictures of Joe Biden in the little in the trailer where the manager sits for
Right.
sure.
Right.
Do we want that? Do we want people merging their identities with the national government of the United States and the president? I
Right.
mean, now, so I'll just leave that sitting there for a second. But yeah, if we go local with it, it's a different story. It's still essentially the same mechanism, but if it's a city like Oakland, or if it's a city like
Mhm.
Chicago, or if it's a city like well, cities, most of the cities are run by black Democrats, right? So if it, you know, I don't love those people either, but it's at least significantly different than being employed by
Right.
whoever the American people, as a broad ignorant mass as they are, choose to be our leader. I mean, that is just
Mhm.
seems like an awful idea. We don't want, I mean, if you want to take rebellion out of black people, rebelliousness out of black people, which historically they've always been our primary rebels, right? That's the great way to do it, is get them working for the man.
Right.
So I don't
Yeah, I
know.
mean, I think the national level, I think that's even more of a pipe dream than trying to achieve something locally, right? We can't even do simple things at the national level right now, right? I mean,
Sure.
so
Yeah.
I think the locally, I mean, my sense that the numbers are there, right? That it's an idea that will have more traction within a place like you say in Oakland or Chicago, and that the oversight would be there, right? That people would be able to criticize it, they could be able to
Yeah.
intervene, possibly that it's closer to them as an
That's right.
institution.
That's
So,
right. Yeah.
so that's more my sense, right?
Right.
At the same time, I mean, if you think about like national service, I'm sure you wouldn't be in favor of this either, but
Oof.
like in other places, right? Frederick Jameson's tried to make the argument about national service.
Oof.
Yeah.
I'm allergic to that idea.
Right. But I mean, I think it speaks to what kind of nation we are, right? Like there's other places where, in a different moment, in a place where people are politicized, maybe a smaller country, right? Where there's more in the way of
Accountability.
accountability,
Right.
maybe more culturally, where folks see it as a different, that I really want to serve this country. You know what I mean? There's a different
Yeah.
sense of allegiance, right, to
Yes.
it, and a faith in like the leadership and what was possible.
Yes.
But that's not here, right? That's not the situation that we have,
Right.
which is why I think like scale down, would be the best way to go.
I like it the more you're saying it. Yeah, I could see that being actually a very good thing. I might even vote for it when it comes up for a vote in Oakland in the year 2090. after three revolutions and
Right.
civil wars, which is what it would take. All right, let's do a little let's finish up by doing a little bit deeper dive on theory. But this also circles back to the beginning of the conversation about your background and race versus class. So you've been engaged in the class versus race war for really since you started, I think, being a scholar, which I've been immersed in since the early 90s when I went to grad school. And as I said, Barbara Fields was one of my professors and had a huge influence on me. I first time I read it, I told her this on the show, but because I didn't tell her when I was actually at Columbia because I was so intimidated by her. But the when I sat down as a 27-year-old graduate student at Columbia University in the highly respected, prestigious history department, to read her article, I thought that there were different biological races. I thought there were different biological races. I wasn't so sure about like one being superior to the other, but I thought there were different biological races that meant something socially too. And then I never forget, I told her this, but like I remember walking out of the library after reading her article and just like my whole world just like got turned upside down. And ever since then, I've been a race abolitionist.
Right.
A race abolitionist. And I know you wrote a critique of David Roediger and his very important book, The Wages of Whiteness. And I want to talk about that. I became a whiteness guy, a whiteness scholar. I loved that. I taught and assigned Roediger's book, I think, every year for about 20 years when I was teaching at Columbia, Barnard, elsewhere, Occidental College.
Right.
And but at the same time, like I love the Marxist critique of race as being epiphenomenal, as being just sort of a set of ideas that are produced, may come out of the material conditions of a society, but just aren't material. They're not scientific, right? And I want to abolish the damn thing. Like overall, I want us to get to a non-racial society. I mean, the colorblind, that's a Reagan particular iteration of this, which had other purposes. But like, so as I said earlier, like to be specific, police violence makes me as upset as anything in the world. But the thing is, like almost every day, some white person gets beaten down or killed by the cops in this country, and no one talks about it. No one talks about it. So if we could have a non-racial coalition where we don't even mention race, where we have like on stage, we have Breonna Taylor's family, we have George Floyd's family, we have Eric Garner's family, we have Tamir Rice's family, alongside the families of Duncan Lemp and all the other people who have been brutalized in exactly or worse ways, who are white, and to never mention race. I don't want that word to be, I don't want white, black, brown. I don't want that to be spoken. I want all of us to be sitting on stage, the victims, the families and friends of victims of police violence and brutality, who are of all colors, in which we don't talk about color. We talk about reforming in moderate ways or radical ways, but we reform or overthrow the whole, whatever it is. But I want to have this conversation, the kind that you and I are having, rather than, again, chasing racism constantly, chasing the racist thoughts of cops, right? And we know, I mean, we don't have to do this, but like we know that black cops are more likely to shoot people than white cops. You know, they're both quite likely to shoot, but you know, it's getting black cop. We found this out really early in the 1970s, and you didn't need to hear NWA to understand this. But like when we had black cops in the beginning of the 1970s, they turned out to be just as brutal or more brutal than white cops. So that's not going to fix things. People who are definitely not racist, being just as bad or worse than the racist cops, right?
Right.
So, so you believe, right? Do you believe? I mean, you have, obviously, you're very much influenced by Marxism, and that's where this comes from. But what do you? I guess I'm circling back to the same question, or I'm asking you the same question in a different way.
Mhm.
How do you deal with the class? Where do you fit in the class versus race argument? You've talked about class reductionism, race reductionism. Maybe you want to like explain those concepts for people, and then talk about where you fit in there and what your interventions have been.
Right.
Is that
So I always start from, and I love Barbara Fields' work, right? I would start from a simple point she makes where she's like, race and class are concepts of a different order, right?
exactly? Yeah.
That they can't replace one another.
Right.
And that the key distinction, and this is one that gets lost, especially when people are trying to ferret out racism, right? And that's all they want to do,
Right.
is that race is ideological, and purely so, right? Whereas class certainly has ideological dimensions, but there's the material basis to it. And nowadays, you hear all of this attempt to try to square the circle, right? So then there's the materiality of race, or
Mm-hmm.
the novelty of racial capitalism as a concept that people throw out, but oftentimes don't define or deal with the origins of it within either South African communist debates, during apartheid, or even within the work of Cedric J. Robinson, right? They don't necessarily deal with that fully, and the limitations of it. But for me, that they're two separate concepts. I don't. I'm fatigued on the race versus class back and forth. I
Yeah.
thought Adolph Reed's response on a recent show was really great, where he said he's not here to talk about race versus class, or race first versus class first, but it's capitalism first, right? That should be our focus, right? And I think, there's so many other things that Adolph says, that was just the perfect way to sum it up. Because when we focus on that, right, once we begin to talk historically and in grounded context, when we take geography seriously, when we try to get a sense of historical conjuncture and the contingencies within every particular moment or event or development, it's impossible to hold on to some of these simplistic formulas about white and black, or the dominance of race and black unity and all these other concepts. Once we really get into the moil of political struggles, once we get into everyday life, um, and up close, like the stuff I was talking about in Louisiana, you can't hold on to those ideas. If you live in a town with 25,000 people, most of them black, there's no sense you can have that black people all share the same
Mm.
interests or the
Mm.
same ideas,
Mm-hmm.
because you see the fights, they're fighting constantly, debating about different things.
Mm-hmm.
So I think, for me, and I'm not a historian, even though I see myself as having a historical sensibility, coming from the Marxist dimensions, I don't think we can talk about history honestly in this country, especially in real moments, right, in real time and space, without, like you said, disavowing ourselves of this notion that race as a concept has certainly not biological.
Right.
It's not a biological reality.
Right.
And even though it might exert some social power, it is an ideology, right? And it's
Right.
one that, we don't have to abide, right? We don't have
Right.
to
Right.
perpetuate it,
Right.
but that's the moment we're in, right? We're constantly in this mode of, as Barbara and Karen Fields point out, the mode of racecraft, right? We're constantly, in our speech, in our rhetoric, in our writing, in our actions, treating race as though it is a natural thing, as though there is some basis. And I mean, I was more like you, I would say, coming out of high school, because of that Black nationalist and Afrocentric moment, right?
Mm-hmm.
I held on to some of those ideas about
Mm-hmm.
there being some biological basis. I mean, for me, it was in athletics, right? I remember,
Mm-hmm.
with like the '84 Olympics in LA. I think every race that was won in track and field, from the 100-meter dash all the way up through the marathon was won by some person of African descent.
Mm-hmm.
So in my mind, I'm like, oh shit, that's it, right? There must
Yeah.
be something,
Proof. It's proof.
right? It must be something about, being from, descended from that place that, you're faster, you're better, right? So,
Yep.
but yet when Jimmy the Greek made his comments,
Yeah.
around 88, I was repulsed by it. How could he say that, right? But so it's an interesting way that we
Jimmy the Greek.
embrace it when it's necessary or when we think it, it benefits us, but then we don't want to be boxed in by when we see the real full on scientific, racism idea articulated,
Right. Barbara begins her famous essay that we talked about a lot.
Oh, race and ideology.
Yeah, she begins it with referencing this moment with Jimmy the Greek. A lot of people are too young to know what we're talking about here.
Right.
His comment, I guess he made in the 80s or 70s or something about like how blacks were better at athletics because of what was it? Because of the training that slaves got.
Slavery. Yeah, well, they were breeding the big black
The buck.
woman with the big with the big buck, right?
The creation. It was the invention of the buck for him.
Right.
Was the basis of black athletic prowess. Let
Right.
me throw a couple of monkey wrenches. You will not disagree with this, but Jimmy the Greek would. So, do you know who holds the current record for the 100-yard dash in high school?
I don't.
First high school student to break 10 seconds.
Really?
Happened, I think, last year, maybe 2 years. A white guy, like like me, like not even like an Italian, like a guy who looks like Northern Europe, That's number one. Number two is that, I'm a quarter Jewish, so I got to speak up for my quarter of my family here. Do you know who the 80% of the leading scorers in the first professional basketball league in this country were? They were
Jewish. Yeah.
All Jewish. Yeah, it was a Jewish dominated sport until the 1940s, right? It's like, and boxing. Boxing and basketball were dominated by Jews in the United States, everybody. People like flip out about that when they literally don't believe me when I tell them this.
Yeah, I always go through that example and when I'm teaching some of my intro level classes, we talk about that,
Yeah.
And the way some people explain it is more like, ghettoization or segregation within
Sure.
early, 20th century America, and the fact that they had like access to public courts and
Well, yeah, I mean, I think
it
it's
was a
also that
sport, right?
they were like barred, just like blacks, they were barred from professional occupations where
Right.
you use your mind.
Right.
Right. But
Absolutely.
they were allowed to do, and this is the other reason that Jews were huge in vaudeville and blackface, which, by the way, as not Roediger so much, but others and I have said was really more an expression of envy than of black culture than it was an expression of, degrading
hatred or
degrading black culture. So, but I kind of cut you off there. I'm sorry. You were in midstream there when I cut you off, but yeah, is there more you wanted to say on this class versus race thing? I mean, I guess you're saying that Norman Podhoretz, who's one of the worst people ever, but one of the founding neoconservatives, he did say something quite, I thought, right on back in the 70s. He called American race relations, especially whites, he's calling white attitudes about race. He used the word psychotic. That white Americans, especially liberals, especially wealthy white liberals, are obsessed with it, obsessed with race, and have this whole mythology around it. And they feel this compunction to treat black people as children who need to be saved by them. They feel a tremendous amount of guilt about people they've never met. Right. They feel guilt about the fact that there's some poor person in Louisiana when they live in Brentwood in Los Angeles. And they act on it. They give millions and millions of dollars in some cases, and they invent charities and they invent nonprofits and yada yada. I mean, the obsession with it. So sorry. The obsession with it, he characterized as psychotic, and I think he's right about that. And I've just seen, having been in these circles my entire life, Berkeley, then New York City, then Los Angeles, and academia.
Right.
Academia. Oh my goodness.
Yeah.
I mean, it's just, I've been twice. I've been denied. I'm going to talk about my victimhood real quick. Okay. I've been
Hmm.
denied. I've been denied 2 academic jobs, and I was told I was denied them because of my race.
Really?
Oh yeah, not by the committees, but people who knew people on the committees, by other colleagues.
Right.
Once at Barnard and once at Occidental, I was told that it was because, and you could tell it was like an open search for U.S. history, and all 4 of the finalists were black. Like,
Right.
how could that? There were 800 applicants, and all 4 of the not only that, they were graduate students
Right.
coming out of University of Chicago, by the way. But anyway, and I was like, this is clearly, and it wasn't even an African American studies job. This was a U.S. history, modern history job, right?
Right. Right.
It's so corrupt, and they won't admit it, and they know it's illegal.
Yeah.
But my God, they'll sacrifice not everything, because they won't sacrifice their own jobs.
Right.
As
Right.
I've heard you say that, right? It's like people are very happy to sacrifice other people on the altar of racial justice, but not their own position as a tenured. When I'm like,
Right.
I say this, I'm like, oh, Mr. Tenured white professor, uh, you do-gooder, you bleeding heart liberal, you feel so
Mhm.
terrible about black people and how poor and beaten down they are by police and yet, you know what? And you talk about how we're such a white institution, we need to have more
Right. Right.
black professors here. Well, guess what? The main problem standing in the way is tenure.
Right.
Tenure. Look at the people who have tenure, right? And
Right.
you'll see what color they overwhelmingly are. And that's what makes it more difficult for anybody, but especially black people, to enter that field. It's the
Sure.
it's
Yeah.
the only it's the only industry other than the Supreme Court that has
Yeah.
lifetime job appointments.
Right.
So if you abolish tenure tomorrow, you would have a huge influx
Mm.
of people of all colors and class backgrounds too. You'd have white
Mm.
working class people too.
Right.
So anyway, that's my little rant. Say whatever you want.
Nah, I mean, I'll pick up on the thread about like whites who are obsessed with race. I mean, and we saw that last year, right? I mean, this is
My
one of the things
God,
that
yeah.
gets lost. I actually think that second wave of, we calling it Black Lives Matter, but it was something different. I mean, some of those crowds were overwhelmingly white,
Mm-hmm.
and
Mm-hmm.
and it wasn't real politics, right? So
Right.
I know here in Chicago, it seemed like daily there was multiple marches going on,
Mm-hmm.
and these things were overwhelmingly white. A lot of them were on the north side.
Mm-hmm.
Can you imagine, like, a crowd of all whites marching against police brutality past Wrigley
Yeah.
Field? Like, this was what we saw, all last year,
Right.
and all last summer. I'm thinking, what the hell was that all about? Like, there's no end game, right? They weren't protesting for, something immediate. This wasn't like a sit-in, in Birmingham or somewhere
Yeah.
where they're trying to do something. They're trying to accomplish something immediate in terms of policy. It was literally like a demonstration of affinity or, support. But beyond that, not much else, and I think the reason why it's so captivating, is precisely because of the dissonance that you mentioned, right? Like, if you're doing well, but you know that there are people across town who are suffering, if you're a decent human being, you're going to be worried by that. You're going to be like, well, shit, I can't fully enjoy this life I have. It kind of spoils it knowing that there are other people who don't have some of the same things or could possibly have the same things.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that for some people is unbearable. But they are willing to bear, the society and the type of economy we have that produces people who are like struggling, and so that's the
Mm-hmm.
weird part about it. It's like,
Mm-hmm.
I don't like seeing that. I don't want to know that there are people who are homeless and who are struggling, and or somebody who can't get into college because he can't afford to pay for it or whatever else.
Right.
But I'm not gonna, like I said, I'm not gonna let go of the shit that I have, right? And I'm also not gonna
Right. Nor should you.
also not going to reject the society, right, which
Right.
produces all this inequality that we're living with, right? I
Right.
mean, that's the difficult thing, and most people don't even want to talk about that. I mean, it's better than it was, right? I mean, there's been some improvements in terms of
Right.
what people are willing to talk about nowadays, but I think that's when you really see the limits of it, is when you really begin to push for something more concrete. I mean, I'll give you one last example from here in part of Chicago where I did some work for a while, in Oak Park, where there's the history of strong embrace of a racial liberalism, here, right? For the listeners of the show, Oak Park really took some strong efforts, or really really concerted effort to try to integrate, unlike a lot of other Chicago suburbs, right? So um Percy Julian, black scientist, buys a house here in Oak Park in 1959. um and his house is firebombed before he even gets into it, right? Before he even moves in. So
Welcome to the neighborhood.
right, and this is the town. This is the town that produced, Ernest Hemingway. It's where Frank Lloyd Wright lived.
Oh.
Paul Harvey grew up here. Ray Kroc had a house,
Oh,
here
wow.
in the
Okay.
park. So this sort of all of this sort of long established tradition of, influential Americans who come out of here. His house is firebombed. And then once he and his family move in, he actually sits and takes turns with his son with a shotgun, standing watch over the house, right, to make sure it doesn't happen again. Some Oak Parkers, are pissed and they leave. They're like, we're out of here, right? This place is going to go downhill from here because Austin, which is right next door, was already experiencing a changeover with more and more Black Southerners moving in. And so some of the more liberal Oak Parkers said, we're not going to stand for this. We're actually going to, take some strides to make sure that this remains an integrated community. And some of the things they do were great, right? They shook down landlords and demanded that they let Blacks rent. So that was kind of good. But then they did some other things that were, to go back to the patronizing theme, they would ask Black newcomers to prepare a resume and share with the neighbors, right? To let the neighbors know, right, that they were like, good people, and
respectability politics, right?
They also had block parties, which was a way to meet and greet the new, the new Black person on the block, and those still happen in Oak Park, right? That's still something that happens, but not with people have forgotten the racial background of it. Now it's just summertime block party.
Okay,
we get to see everybody, but so Oak Park is better off though than any of the other suburbs, in the sense that every street you go down in Oak Park probably has Black and white families and other, Latino families and Asian families on them. There's a lot more interracial couples. The school is one of the most diverse in the region. And unlike Evanston, which has the same proportions, Black and white, Oak Park, like I said, is more integrated. Okay. Evanston is segregated. The thing about Oak Park, though, right? If you want to talk about race, you can talk about race all day and all night, right? People, if you push that button, they're with you. If you talk about condo construction and what that means for the cost of living, there's been a condo boom in Oak Park. So the organization I was working with, this was one of the things that I kept trying to bring to their attention, that like, you're focused on making sure that there's a certain percentage of whites living in this zone. But ultimately, if these condos keep going up, the prices of, cost of housing is going to continue to rise. And a lot of Black people won't be able to afford to live in Oak Park anymore, right? That did not go very far, right? Because that sort of discussion requires, again, the same political economy, analysis that we've been talking about. And, it's much easier to say, I want the photo op. I want to live in a place where when I open up the brochure, there's Black and white kids running down the street together. Or I want to live in a place where, there's a documentary that was done about Oak Park and River Forest High School, by the same guy who did Hoop Dreams, Steve James, who's an Oak Park resident, right? So he did a documentary called America to Me, which is basically a sequel to Hoop Dreams. It's like, Black people are suffering, and even when they're in suburban wealthy school districts, they still suffer, right? Is sort of the punchline of it. But no sort of analysis of the economy. I just think that's our problem as Americans. I mean, from the founding, as we've already kind of covered, this nation has elided class, right? Class doesn't matter.
Yep.
Correct. If you want to be something, you just have to work hard, and you have to be virtuous, and you you'll get the things that you deserve, you'll achieve the station you want in life. And so for some people, it's easy to reconcile the idea that people don't make it. If people don't make it, they don't make it because of racism, because some jackass who's, mistreating them.
Mhm.
Not that the society will always produce people, will always produce inequality, right?
Right.
And produce people who are unemployed and people who are in poverty, right? So I think that's just a tougher thing for people to get. But Oak Park will drive you mad if you try to have those conversations. Like, they'll talk about racism, but they won't talk about, homeless shelter placement.
Right.
Uh,
They won't talk about the material conditions of Oak Park.
No, they will not
Right.
do that, right? That is
Right.
just
Okay.
not the way to talk. And even if you make a strong case for why that is the reason why some of the inequality exists,
Right.
it's just not something that people are attentive to. But
Yeah.
if I get up and tell a story about how, I was wrongly stopped in a boutique when I was trying to purchase,
Oh, they will love that.
then
They will
it's
love
it's
that.
like the pitchforks are out, right? And
Yeah.
people are ready to march. But
Yep. Mhm. I know the type very well.
yeah, this is where we are, though.
The same people who told me it was deeply immoral of me to not vote for the author of the crime bill.
Mm,
Deeply immoral to not vote for Joe Biden, who
right.
is probably racist. I mean, seems
Well,
like
people
he
forget. I mean, do you remember what he said about? Remember what he said about
predators.
Obama before he was picked as his running mate, right?
Oh yeah, being clean and articulate.
Yeah. Like, that is the worst thing he could have said, right? He's like, unlike the rest of the black leaders, he's clean, he's articulate, unlike the rest of the unwashed.
The author of the
Black
94
preachers, street corner preachers or something.
1 minute, everybody on the left, liberals and real leftists, and even a lot of conservatives, by the way, are saying that police brutality, mass incarceration are the emergency issue. That's the problem, right? And I don't disagree with them.
Yeah.
And the next minute, they're telling me I'm a bad person for not voting for the author of most of that. Please explain that. Like, I mean, Trump, like, in his wildest dreams, he couldn't incarcerate as many people as Joe Biden is responsible for. Like, anyway, we're good. Thank you, man. This has been tremendously fun, informative. It's made me think, as you always do, and I'm honored that you came on.
Hey, man, thanks so much for having me.
Anytime. Let's
Really
do it again.
enjoyed it. Appreciate it.
All right. Thank you, Cedric. Have a good day.
All right, you too.
Bye-bye. This is the Unregistered podcast, and I'm Thaddeus Russell. To join the new Renegade University, go to renegadeuniversity.com. To join the new Unregistered Underground, the supporting listeners group for the podcast, go to unregisteredunderground.com. Thanks for listening.